December 19th, 1944. Winston Churchill picks up the phone in London. The voice on the other end belongs to General Dwight Eisenhower, and what he's about to say will make the British Prime Minister think the Supreme Allied Commander has completely lost his mind. Prime Minister, General Patton is turning an entire army 90 degrees north. He says he can reach Bastogne in 72 hours. Churchill's response is immediate. His hand tightens around the receiver. His jaw drops. Tell me that's a mistake. Tell me you meant 72 days, not hours. But it's not a mistake. Right now, at this very moment, the 101st Airborne Division is surrounded and dying in Bastogne. Ammunition running out. Supplies gone. Medical stations overwhelmed with wounded soldiers who have nothing left to treat them with. German artillery shells are falling every few minutes. The perimeter shrinks hour by hour. Military experts across the Allied command structure have calculated the timeline. Any relief force will take 3 weeks minimum to arrive. The Soviets laugh when they hear Patton's promise. Montgomery's staff runs the numbers and declares it mathematically impossible. The roads are sheets of ice. A blizzard blankets everything in white death. The Germans control every single mile between Third Army's current position and that frozen hellhole called Bastogne. And George S. Patton has just promised to move 250,000 men, 133,000 vehicles, and over 100,000 tons of equipment through all of that in 72 hours. Can he actually do it? Will his army make it in time? Or will this audacious gamble end in the greatest disaster of the entire war? Stick around to the end, because what happens next will leave you absolutely speechless. This is the story of the most impossible promise ever made in military history. The situation in December 1944 was nothing short of catastrophic. Hitler had launched his final desperate gamble through the Ardennes forest. Operation Watch on the Rhine caught the Americans completely off guard. German forces punched through thinly defended American lines with devastating efficiency. Within days, they had carved out a bulge 50 miles deep and 70 miles across in the Allied front. American defensive positions crumbled like sandcastles against a tidal wave. Entire divisions found themselves surrounded, cut off, fighting for survival in the frozen forests of Belgium. The weather made everything worse. Dense fog smothered the battlefield, grounding all Allied air support. The planes that had dominated the skies and made German movement suicidal during daylight hours sat useless on their airstrips. Snow and ice turned every road into a death trap. Temperatures plunged to -10 degrees Celsius. Vehicles that started in the morning might not start again by afternoon. Soldiers suffered frostbite within hours of exposure. The Germans had chosen their timing perfectly. At the center of this chaos sat Bastogne, a small Belgian town that happened to be the crossroads of 7 major roads. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the entire region. The Germans needed it. The Americans knew they couldn't let them have it. So the 101st Airborne Division dug in and prepared to die. The numbers were grim. The 101st had approximately 11,000 men defending a perimeter that shrank every day. They faced elements of multiple German divisions, including panzer units with tanks and heavy artillery. Their ammunition stocks dropped by the hour. Medical supplies had run out days ago. Wounded soldiers received nothing but bandages and prayers. Food was rationed to the point of starvation, and the German commander had sent a message demanding surrender, promising good treatment for prisoners. Acting Division Commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe read the surrender demand. His response became legendary. One word: nuts. But defiance doesn't stop artillery shells. Bravery doesn't manufacture ammunition. The 101st was dying, and everyone knew it. Military planners calculated they had perhaps 48 hours before the position became completely untenable. Maybe 72 if they rationed ammunition severely and got lucky. After that, Bastogne would fall, regardless of how determined the defenders were. The Allies needed a miracle. They needed someone crazy enough to attempt the impossible. Enter George S. Patton. But here's what nobody knew at the time. What made this story even more insane? Patton wasn't improvising. While Eisenhower and Bradley were still processing the scale of the German attack, while staff officers were running calculations and declaring everything impossible, Patton had already been planning for exactly this scenario for 3 weeks. December 12th, 1 full week before the German offensive even began. Patton called his senior logistics officers together for what he termed a theoretical exercise. He spread maps across the table and asked a simple question. What if we needed to rapidly redeploy north? Not an order, just a thought experiment. Plan it out. His staff looked at him like he was crazy. There was no indication of any threat from the north. Intelligence showed no German buildup. But Patton had a feeling. Call it intuition. Call it paranoia. Call it the instincts of a man who had spent his entire life studying warfare. His logistics team went to work. Colonel Walter Mueller, the 3rd Army logistics officer, began pre-positioned fuel dumps along potential routes north. Maintenance teams identified forward repair points. Traffic control plans were drafted, refined, and refined again. Alternate supply routes were mapped. Every possible contingency was considered. When Eisenhower called on December 19th with what he thought was an impossible emergency request, Patton pulled out his notebook. The page was already marked. The plans were already complete. "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours, Patton said calmly. The room at Supreme Headquarters fell silent. Officers exchanged glances. Some thought Patton had finally gone completely mad. But Patton wasn't mad. He was prepared. The challenge facing Third Army defied conventional military logic. These 250,000 men weren't sitting idle in reserve somewhere. They were actively engaged in offensive operations, attacking German positions along the Siegfried Line in the Saar region. What Eisenhower was asking wasn't a simple redeployment. This was asking Patton to disengage from active combat without letting the Germans exploit the withdrawal, then physically rotate one of history's largest mechanized armies through a perfect 90-degree turn, then traverse ice-covered roads through a 70-mile corridor, then arrive ready to immediately attack a numerically superior German force that had just achieved one of the war's most stunning tactical victories. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's operations officer calculated minimum time for such a maneuver at 3 weeks, assuming perfect conditions. The American First Army staff suggested 2 weeks as wildly optimistic. Soviet advisors simply laughed. Their experience suggested anything less than a month was pure fantasy. Patton had offered 72 hours. December 19th, 8 a.m. Third Army Headquarters in Nancy, France. The conference room fell into absolute silence when Patton entered. His chief of staff had assembled the principal commanders. Maps covered every surface. The logistics officer looked like he hadn't slept in days, because he hadn't. Patton wasted no time with pleasantries. "Gentlemen, we're going to relieve Bastogne. 3rd Corps will lead. 4th Armored Division spearheading. We attack in 48 hours. The room erupted. Not with objections. You didn't object to Patton. But questions cascaded over one another like a waterfall of impossibility. How do we disengage from current operations? What about fuel supplies? The road network can't handle this volume. The weather, sir. The goddamn weather. Patton raised one hand. Silence returned instantly. Colonel Mueller, fuel status. Mueller consulted his notes. His hands trembled visibly. Sir, current reserves give us approximately 400,000 gallons. That's nowhere near sufficient. We'd need minimum 1.2 million gallons for the initial push alone. Get it. Sir, the supply lines... I didn't ask about problems, Colonel. I asked you to get it. This was vintage Patton. His biographer would later write that Patton didn't recognize logistical impossibilities. He recognized logistical challenges that required aggressive solutions. The difference wasn't semantic. It was operational philosophy. The operations officer stepped forward with the next impossible problem. General, the road network. We've mapped 3 primary routes north. Total capacity, based on standard doctrine, is approximately 20,000 vehicles per 24-hour period. We need to move more than 6 times that number. Patton studied the map. His finger traced the routes. Main highway through Luxembourg. Secondary road through Arlon. Tertiary farm road network through smaller towns. Then we don't move sequentially. We move simultaneously. All 3 routes, around the clock. No stops, except for mechanical failure. Sir, doctrine requires 4-hour rest periods for drivers every... Doctrine is for peacetime and cowards. We're neither. The 101st doesn't get 4-hour rest periods while they're being shelled in Bastogne. Neither do we. The traffic control plan that emerged read like orchestrated madness. Every route was subdivided into 10-kilometer segments. Each segment had a traffic control team, with authority to override unit commanders if flow demanded it. Vehicles traveled with headlights on. Blackout discipline be damned because speed mattered more than stealth. Rest stops were scheduled to the minute. Fuel trucks pre-positioned every 20 kilometers. Military police received one specific order that came directly from Patton himself. If some son of a bitch breaks down and won't move to the shoulder, you put a bullet in his engine block and push him off the road. The 101st doesn't have time for traffic courtesy. By evening of December 19th, 3 massive columns were grinding north through ice and darkness. The 4th Armored Division led on the primary route. The 81st Infantry Division followed on the secondary. The 26th Infantry Division took the farm roads. Behind them, strung out for 50 miles, came support echelons, fuel trucks, ammunition haulers, maintenance companies, medical units, signal detachments. The temperature dropped to -10°C. Ice coated every road surface. Visibility dropped below half a mile. And Patton's army kept moving. The first casualties weren't from enemy action. They were from the roads themselves. Ice caused dozens of vehicles to slide into ditches. Mechanical failures skyrocketed in the extreme cold. Engines that should have lasted another 1,000 miles seized up after 50. Drivers pushed beyond exhaustion fell asleep at the wheel. But the columns kept moving. German commanders monitoring American radio traffic initially interpreted this as retreat, a withdrawal under pressure. Captured documents from the 11th Panzer Division show their intelligence officer reporting, "Enemy forces in our sector showing decreased resistance. Possible preparation for defensive consolidation." They had no idea what was actually happening. The Americans weren't retreating. They were pivoting. Back in London, Churchill convened his military advisors. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, reviewed what passed for Patton's operational plan and was characteristically skeptical. His diary entry for December 19th recorded his thoughts. Patton promises to reach Bastogne in 3 days. I give him 10 if he's extraordinarily lucky. The Americans possess admirable optimism and inadequate understanding of winter warfare logistics. Churchill himself was torn. He'd worked with Patton during the Sicily campaign and recognized the man's peculiar genius for mobile warfare. But this wasn't Sicily. This was winter. This was mechanized warfare at a scale unprecedented in military history. If Patton failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. Bastogne would fall. The Allied front would be in genuine jeopardy. The entire timetable for ending the European war could shift by months. But Churchill kept circling back to one uncomfortable fact. Patton had never failed to deliver on his promises. Impetuous, yes. Politically troublesome? Absolutely. But when George Patton said his army would be somewhere at a specific time, they were there. December 20th, 6 a.m. Third Army's columns had been moving for 16 continuous hours. Major General Hugh Gaffey, commanding the 4th Armored Division at the spearhead, radioed back to Patton with a progress report. Progress slower than planned. Roads worse than anticipated. Estimate we've covered 35 miles in 16 hours. That's barely 2 miles per hour. Patton's response was immediate. Not interested in past progress. What's your estimated time to maintain current pace? 60 hours, sir. Unacceptable. You've got 48. Find a way. Gaffey pushed harder. His staff identified secondary road networks that could shave 10 miles off the route. Riskier roads, narrower, less maintained, higher chance of traffic bottlenecks, but faster. He ordered 4th Armored to take them. Meanwhile, in Bastogne, the 101st Airborne could hear distant artillery. They knew relief was coming. They just didn't know if it would arrive in time. McAuliffe ordered ammunition conservation. Every round had the count. They might need to hold for days yet. But they didn't know about Patton's secret preparation. They didn't know about the 3 weeks of planning. They didn't know that an army was tearing through ice and darkness at speeds no one thought possible. By midnight on December 20th, 3rd Army had covered 60 miles in 36 hours. The impossible was becoming possible. But they still had 35 miles to go, and between them and Bastogne stood the German army. The real battle was about to begin. But that's a story for part 2, because what happens next will show you why the German High Command would later write in their war diaries that American mobility defied explanation. Why Soviet generals who had fought the Germans for 3 brutal years would study this operation in disbelief. And why Winston Churchill would eventually admit he had been completely, utterly wrong. The 101st Airborne is running out of time. Patton's army is running out of road. And somewhere in the frozen darkness between them, German panzer divisions are preparing to stop what everyone said couldn't be done anyway. Can Patton keep his impossible promise? Will the 4th Armored break through in time? Or will Bastogne fall before help arrives? 3rd Army had covered 60 miles in 36 hours. Patton had promised the impossible. His columns were grinding through ice and darkness toward Bastogne. The 101st Airborne was running out of ammunition, running out of time, running out of hope. And somewhere between them stood the entire German 5th Panzer Army. But covering ground was one thing. Breaking through enemy lines was something else entirely. Because what Patton's men were about to face would make the frozen roads seem like a pleasant Sunday drive. The Germans knew relief was coming. They had prepared. and they had positioned their elite Fallschirmjäger paratroopers directly in 4th Armored Division's path. The statistics were brutal. German forces defending the approaches to Bastogne numbered approximately 15,000 men, with tank support and dug-in artillery positions. American intelligence estimated Patton would need a 3-to-1 numerical advantage to break through prepared defenses. He had barely 1-to-1. The temperature had dropped to -15 Celsius. Visibility was near zero, and the clock was ticking down to Bastogne's final collapse. This is where everything became worse. December 21st, 0200 hours. Patton's lead elements were 48 hours into the movement and approaching the Ardennes proper. They had covered an astounding 60 miles through conditions that should have stopped any army cold. Major General Hugh Gaffey radioed his progress report with exhaustion evident in every word. "Sir, we're 25 miles from Bastogne. Men have been moving for 2 days straight. Vehicles are breaking down. We need rest." Patton's response cut through the radio static like a blade. "The 101st needs rest too. They're not getting any. Neither are you. Keep moving." "General, my division commanders are requesting at least 4 hours to consolidate. Reconnaissance reports German positions directly ahead. We need intelligence, coordination, preparation." "Here's your intelligence update, Gaffey. There's a road from here to Bastogne. Germans are on it. You will drive through them. That's all the reconnaissance you need." Gaffey understood. This wasn't about doctrine. This wasn't about proper military procedure. This was about 11,000 American paratroopers who would die if 4th Armored stopped for even a few hours. He pushed his men forward into the darkness. But the Germans were waiting. The first contact came at 0800 hours on December 22nd. 4th Armored's lead elements ran directly into prepared positions held by the 5th Fallschirmjäger Division. These weren't demoralized rear echelon troops. These were elite German paratroopers who had been specifically positioned to block exactly this approach. They had anti-tank guns concealed in farmhouses, machine gun nests dug into frozen earth, artillery zeroed in on every crossroad. The first American Sherman tanks to crest the ridge never knew what hit them. German 88mm shells punched through armor like paper. 6 tanks exploded in the first 10 minutes. Infantry following behind dove for cover in ditches filled with ice water. The advance ground to a halt. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, assessed the situation with cold fury. His radio crackled with reports from his company commanders. Heavy resistance, casualties mounting, no way forward. But Abrams had served under Patton long enough to know that no way forward was not an acceptable report. He studied the terrain through his binoculars. The German line was strong in the center. Anti-tank guns covered every approach. Frontal assault would be suicide. Then he saw it. A small farm track leading west, barely visible under the snow. Not on any map, just a path that local farmers used to move between fields. It wound through a patch of forest and emerged behind the German left flank. "That's our route," Abrams muttered. His operations officer looked at him like he was insane. "Sir, that track won't support tank movement. It's too narrow. If we get stuck, we're finished." "Then we won't get stuck. Combat Command B takes the farm track. Combat Command A keeps the Germans busy here. We split our force and hit them from behind." Splitting forces in the face of the enemy violated every principle of armored warfare doctrine. You concentrate strength against weakness. You don't divide your already outnumbered force into 2 even smaller pieces. But doctrine wasn't going to save Bastogne. Audacity might. Abrams made the call. Half his tanks would continue frontal pressure. The other half would attempt the impossible flanking maneuver through terrain that no military planner would ever consider passable. The farm track was a nightmare. Tanks slid on ice. Tracks churned mud and snow into an impassable soup. 3 Shermans bogged down within the first mile. Crews abandoned them without hesitation. There was no time to recover stuck vehicles. The column pressed forward, leaving their comrades behind. For 2 hours, Combat Command B crawled through the forest. German scouts spotted them twice. Both times, American machine gunners eliminated the threat before warnings could be sent. The element of surprise held. Barely. At 1600 hours, Abrams tanks emerged from the forest directly behind the German defensive line. The Fallschirmjäger had positioned all their heavy weapons facing south, expecting the American attack to come from that direction. They never anticipated tanks appearing from the west. The slaughter lasted 12 minutes. American Shermans opened fire at point-blank range into the German rear. Anti-tank guns that had stopped the frontal assault were destroyed before their crews could turn them around. Machine gun nests were overrun by tanks that simply drove over them. German paratroopers, among the most elite soldiers in Hitler's army, broke and ran. By 1630 hours, the German defensive line had collapsed. 4th Armored Division poured through the gap. Bastogne was now less than 15 miles away. But those 15 miles were the most contested ground on the Western Front. Word of the American breakthrough reached German headquarters within hours. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, immediately recognized the danger. If the Americans reached Bastogne, his entire offensive would stall. He ordered every available unit to block the relief force. Panzer reserves that had been pushing deeper into Allied territory were turned around. Infantry divisions force-marched through the night to establish new defensive positions. The Germans would not make the same mistake twice. This time, they would defend in depth. Multiple lines, overlapping fields of fire, no flanks to exploit. Patton received the intelligence reports at his forward command post. His staff briefed him on the new German dispositions. 3 defensive lines between 4th Armored and Bastogne, each one stronger than the position Abrams had just broken through. Colonel Oskar Koch, 3rd Army's intelligence officer, delivered his assessment with obvious reluctance. "Sir, the Germans have repositioned significant forces. Panzer reserves are moving to block our advance. At current rates of progress, we're looking at another 48 to 72 hours minimum to fight through." Patton's face remained impassive. "What's the ammunition situation in Bastogne?" "Based on our last communication, General McAuliffe estimates they have 24 hours of combat supplies remaining. Maybe 36 if they severely ration." "Then we don't have 48 hours. We have 24. Get Gaffey on the radio." The conversation that followed would become legendary in 3rd Army history. "Hugh, I need you in Bastogne by tomorrow night." Gaffey's response was barely audible over the static. "George, we've been fighting for 2 days straight. My men are exhausted. We just broke through 1 German line. Intelligence says there are 3 more between us and the objective." "I know." "The tanks need maintenance. We're running low on ammunition. I've got wounded men who need evacuation." "I know." "What you're asking is impossible." Patton's voice hardened. "Hugh, I've never asked you for something impossible. I've asked you for something difficult. There's a difference. Those boys in Bastogne have been doing the impossible for a week. All I'm asking is that you do something difficult for 1 more day. Can you do that?" Silence on the radio. Then Gaffey's voice came back, stronger than before. "We'll be there, George, one way or another." Patton hung up the receiver. He turned to his staff. "Get me every available artillery battery, every fighter bomber the moment this weather clears, and find me more fuel. I don't care where it comes from." December 23rd dawned with the first break in the weather the Allies had seen in a week. The fog lifted, the clouds parted, and for the first time since the German offensive began, American aircraft could fly. The effect was immediate and devastating. P-47 Thunderbolts screamed out of the sky over German positions. Fighter bombers that had been grounded for days unleashed their full fury on enemy columns caught in the open. Tanks that had been racing to reinforce the Bastogne defenders exploded under rocket attacks. Supply convoys burned on every road. German soldiers who had grown accustomed to moving freely in daylight suddenly found themselves hunted from above. Patton's artillery joined the carnage. Every gun that could reach the German lines opened fire simultaneously. The barrage lasted 4 hours. When it finally lifted, entire German defensive positions had simply ceased to exist. 4th Armored Division attacked at noon on December 23rd with everything they had left. The first German line crumbled within 2 hours. The second held for 4 hours before American tanks found a gap and poured through. The third line, hastily constructed and undermanned after the air attacks, broke at 1800 hours. By nightfall, 4th Armored was 5 miles from Bastogne, close enough that the defenders could hear American artillery firing in support. Close enough that German radio intercepts confirmed American tanks were on the way. Close enough that hope, real hope, began to spread through the frozen foxholes of the 101st Airborne. But those last 5 miles would be the hardest of all. German commanders, knowing that Bastogne's relief would doom their offensive, threw everything they had into stopping 4th Armored. Panzer units that had been the spearhead of the German attack were now fighting desperately defensive actions. Tiger tanks, the most feared armored vehicles in the German arsenal, were positioned at every crossroad. The approaches to Bastogne became a killing ground. The night of December 23rd was the longest of the war for the men of 4th Armored Division. They fought through darkness, through freezing temperatures, through German positions that seemed to multiply every time one was destroyed. Casualties mounted by the hour. Tanks that had survived hundreds of miles of movement were knocked out within sight of their objective. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams lost 3 more tanks that night. His 37th Battalion, which had started the operation with 54 Shermans, was down to 31. His men had been awake for over 70 hours. Some were falling asleep between firefights, their bodies simply unable to continue without rest. But they kept moving. At 0400 hours on December 26th, Abrams' lead elements reached the outskirts of Bastogne, the last village before Bastogne. German forces had fortified every building. Machine guns covered every street. It was the final obstacle. Abrams made the only decision that made sense. He ordered his remaining tanks to charge straight through the village at maximum speed. No stopping to engage individual positions. No careful clearing of buildings. Just raw speed and firepower, betting everything on momentum. The charge through Bastogne lasted 9 minutes. American tanks roared down the main street at 30 miles per hour, firing in every direction. German soldiers dove for cover or died where they stood. Buildings collapsed under tank fire. The entire village became a chaos of smoke, flame, and screaming engines. And then they were through. At 16:45 hours on December 26, 1944, First Lieutenant Charles P. Bogus, commanding a platoon of 3 Sherman tanks from the 37th Tank Battalion, spotted American positions ahead. Foxholes, defensive wire, soldiers in American uniforms with weapons pointed at his approaching tanks. Bulge stood in his turret, waving frantically. "We're 4th Armored, from 3rd Army!" For a moment, nothing happened. The 101st Airborne Defenders had been fooled before by Germans in American uniforms. They kept their weapons trained on the approaching tanks. Then a sergeant from the 101st lowered his rifle and shouted back, "You're goddamn right you are!" Contact. Patton had delivered exactly what he promised. 72 hours. Not 73, not 74. 72 hours from the moment he made his impossible promise to Eisenhower, American tanks were breaking through to Bastogne. The immediate relief was limited. Just one company of tanks and a handful of support vehicles made it through initially. But the corridor was open. By midnight, a steady stream of trucks was pouring into Bastogne, carrying ammunition, medical supplies, food, and reinforcements. General McAuliffe's message to the relieving forces was characteristically understated. "Gee, I am mighty glad to see you." His operations officer's diary entry was more revealing. "None of us believed they'd actually make it. We'd resigned ourselves to fighting to the last round. Then they appeared like something out of mythology. Exhausted, battered, but here." Churchill received the news on December 27th. His response, recorded by his private secretary, was a mixture of admiration and something approaching awe. "I told Eisenhower it was a mistake, that Patton meant days, not hours. I was the one who was mistaken. The Americans have accomplished something I thought impossible." The German High Command was equally stunned. Von Manteuffel's war diary recorded his assessment with brutal honesty. "American relief force has reached Bastogne. Speed of enemy movement defies explanation. Our intelligence estimates were catastrophically wrong. The enemy demonstrated mobility and operational tempo we did not believe mechanized forces could achieve in winter conditions." Hitler's reaction was volcanic rage. His entire Ardennes offensive had been built on the assumption that American forces couldn't rapidly redeploy. Patton had just shattered that assumption so completely that the strategic logic of the entire operation collapsed. But the story doesn't end here. Because while Bastogne was relieved, it wasn't yet secure. The corridor 4th Armored had punched through was barely a mile wide. German forces still surrounded the town on 3 sides. And Hitler, refusing to accept defeat, ordered his commanders to close that corridor at any cost. The battle for Bastogne was far from over. The Germans were about to launch their most desperate counterattack of the entire war. Fresh panzer divisions were already moving toward the narrow American corridor. SS troops, fanatical and determined, were preparing to cut off the relief force and trap both the 101st Airborne and 4th Armored Division inside the pocket. Patton had won the race to Bastogne. Now he had to hold what he'd taken. And the Germans were about to show him just how much they were willing to sacrifice to reverse his impossible victory. In Part 3, we'll see how the battle turned from relief to survival. How German counterattacks nearly succeeded in closing the corridor and trapping 2 American divisions. How Patton's men fought off assault after assault in temperatures that froze men to death in their foxholes. And how one final, desperate gamble would determine whether the Battle of the Bulge ended in Allied triumph or catastrophic defeat. The impossible promise had been kept, but the real fight was just beginning. Patton had done the impossible. 72 hours, 250,000 men, 90-degree turn through ice and darkness. The 4th Armored Division had punched through to Bastogne exactly when he promised. The 101st Airborne was saved. Churchill admitted he was wrong. The German High Command was stunned. But relief was not victory. The corridor 4th Armored had carved to Bastogne was barely a mile wide. A single road. A thin lifeline surrounded by German forces on every side. And Hitler, refusing to accept that his great offensive had failed, ordered his commanders to do whatever it took to close that corridor and trap both the relievers and the relieved in one massive pocket. The statistics were terrifying. German forces surrounding Bastogne still numbered over 50,000 men. Fresh panzer divisions were racing toward the corridor. SS troops, fanatical and expendable, were massing for counterattacks. American intelligence estimated the Germans would launch their first major assault within 48 hours. They were wrong. The Germans attacked in 24. And now, this was no longer about reaching Bastogne. This was about survival. December 27th, 0600 hours. The German counteroffensive began with an artillery barrage that lit up the pre-dawn darkness like hellfire. Over 200 guns opened fire simultaneously on the narrow American corridor. Shells rained down on the single road connecting Bastogne to the outside world. Supply trucks exploded, ambulances carrying wounded burned. The thin ribbon of American-controlled territory became a killing zone. Then came the tanks. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Hitler's elite armored formation, struck from the east. 32 Tiger and Panther tanks rolled toward the corridor, with infantry following close behind. Their objective was simple: cut the road, trap the Americans, finish what the original offensive had started. Colonel Creighton Abrams received the contact report at 0615. His 37th Tank Battalion, already reduced to 31 Shermans after the relief operation, was positioned directly in the path of the German assault. He had 31 tanks against 32. But the German tanks were Tigers and Panthers. His were Shermans. In a straight fight, the Germans outgunned him 3-1. Abrams didn't plan on a straight fight. He ordered his tanks to fall back to a ridgeline overlooking the main road. Not a retreat, a tactical reposition. The Germans, sensing victory, pursued aggressively. Their Tigers crested the ridge at full speed, expecting to catch the fleeing Americans in the open. Instead, they found Abrams' Shermans hull down behind the ridge, only their turrets exposed, with every gun aimed at the crest. The first Tiger exploded before its crew even knew they were under fire. The second and third followed within seconds. The German column, compressed on the narrow road with no room to maneuver, became a shooting gallery. 11 German tanks burned on that ridge. The 1st SS Panzer Division's assault stalled before it truly began. But this was only the first attack. The Germans launched 3 more assaults on December 27th alone. Each one struck a different point along the corridor. Each one was beaten back with heavy losses on both sides. By nightfall, the corridor still held. Barely. American casualties numbered over 400 in a single day. The road to Bastogne was cratered and burning. But it remained open. Von Manteuffel studied his casualty reports with growing desperation. His war diary recorded his assessment. The Americans defend with ferocity that defies explanation. We have numerical superiority. We have better tanks. We have them surrounded. Yet every attack fails. Their speed of response, their coordination, their willingness to fight to the last man. This is not the army we faced in December. He was right. Something had changed in the American forces. The impossible relief of Bastogne had transformed them. Soldiers who had been retreating for days suddenly believed they could win. Officers who had doubted Patton's promises now trusted him completely. The psychology of the battlefield had shifted. But psychology doesn't stop artillery shells, and the Germans had plenty of those. December 28th brought a new crisis. German bombers, taking advantage of a brief break in the weather, struck Bastogne directly. The town's makeshift hospital took a direct hit. 47 wounded soldiers died in the explosion. Medical supplies that had just arrived through the corridor were destroyed. The 101st Airborne, which had survived a week of siege, now faced renewed shortages. Worse, German ground forces had identified a weakness in the American perimeter. A section of the line held by exhausted troops from the 26th Infantry Division, who had been fighting continuously for 5 days. At 0300 hours on December 29th, 2 German battalions hit that section with everything they had. The line broke. German infantry poured through the gap. For 6 hours, chaos reigned in the American rear. Supply depots were overrun. Communication lines were cut. Bastogne, so recently relieved, seemed on the verge of falling anyway. Patton received the news at 0400. His response was immediate. "Get me Gaffey." The conversation was brief. "Hugh, the 26th line has broken. Germans are in our rear. I need you to seal that breach." "George, my men haven't slept in 4 days. We've lost 40% of our tanks. I don't have reserves." "I know. Do it anyway." Gaffey did it anyway. The 4th Armored Division, which had already accomplished more than any armored formation in the war, turned from defense to counterattack. Tanks that should have been in repair depots rolled into battle. Crews who could barely keep their eyes open loaded shells and fired with mechanical precision. At 0800 hours, they hit the German penetration from 3 sides simultaneously. The fighting that followed was among the most brutal of the entire European campaign. American and German tanks dueled at ranges of less than 100 yards. Infantry fought hand-to-hand in frozen farmhouses. Artillery from both sides rained down indiscriminately. The village of Chinon, in the center of the fighting, changed hands 4 times in 6 hours. By 1400 hours, the German penetration had been eliminated. The survivors retreated back through the gap they had created, leaving behind over 600 dead and 23 destroyed tanks. But the cost was staggering. 4th Armored Division lost another 11 tanks in the counterattack. The 26th Infantry Division suffered 340 casualties. The corridor to Bastogne remained open, but the forces holding it were being ground down hour by hour. That night, Patton made a decision that would define his legacy. He called a meeting of his corps commanders. The situation map showed a grim picture. German forces still surrounded Bastogne on 3 sides. Counterattacks continued daily. American casualties were mounting faster than replacements could arrive. The logical military decision was to consolidate, reinforce the corridor, and wait for the German offensive to exhaust itself. Patton had never made the logical military decision in his life. "Gentlemen, we're going to attack." His commanders stared at him. "George, we're barely holding what we have. We don't have the strength to attack." "The Germans don't know that. They've been attacking us for 3 days and losing every time. Their morale is breaking. Their supplies are running low. If we attack now, we break them completely. And if we fail?" Patton's eyes were cold. "Then we fail attacking. I'd rather fail attacking than succeed defending. We're Americans. We attack." December 30th, 0500 hours. 3rd Army launched Operation Cobra II. Not a defense, not a consolidation. A full-scale offensive against German positions surrounding Bastogne. The attack began in darkness. 3 divisions moved simultaneously. 4th Armored struck northeast toward Houffalize. The 26th Infantry pushed east toward Wiltz. The 35th Infantry Division, newly arrived and fresh, attacked north toward Longchamps. German commanders, expecting another day of grinding down the American corridor, were caught completely off guard. Their forces were positioned for attack, not defense. Reserves had been committed to offensive operations. When the Americans came at them from 3 directions at once, whole units simply collapsed. The town of Luttrebois fell at 7:30. Marville was secured by 900. Neuf, which German forces had held since the offensive began, was in American hands by noon. In 6 hours, Patton's forces had pushed the German line back 3 miles on every front. But the true measure of the offensive came in the casualty figures. German losses on December 30th exceeded 2,200 dead, wounded, and captured. American losses were 487, a ratio of nearly 5-to-1 in offensive operations, against prepared positions in winter. Von Manteuffel's diary entry for that day was a single sentence. "We have lost the initiative. The offensive has failed." He was right. Hitler refused to accept it. He ordered his commanders to continue attacking, to retake the ground they had lost, to close the corridor at any cost. But his orders no longer matched reality. German forces in the Ardennes were exhausted, depleted, and demoralized. The great gamble that was supposed to split the Allied armies and capture Antwerp had resulted in nothing but catastrophic losses. The statistics told the story. Between December 16th and December 31st, German forces in the Ardennes suffered approximately 67,000 casualties. They lost over 600 tanks and assault guns. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed by Allied fighters once the weather cleared. Fuel reserves that were supposed to sustain a drive to the sea were gone. The Wehrmacht's last strategic reserve had been burned up in the frozen forests of Belgium. American losses were significant. Approximately 47,000 casualties across all units involved in the battle. But the Americans could replace their losses. Germany could not. More importantly, the psychological impact rippled through both armies. German soldiers who had believed in one final victory now understood they were losing. Prisoners taken in the final days of December showed shattered morale. Many surrendered without fighting. Some entire units walked into American lines with hands raised, unwilling to die for an offensive everyone knew had failed. American soldiers, in contrast, walked taller. They had been surprised. They had been pushed back. They had been surrounded and besieged. And they had won anyway. The confidence that Patton had always insisted they should have was now proven. They could beat the Wehrmacht at its best, in its chosen terrain, on its chosen timetable. Churchill's assessment, delivered in a speech to the House of Commons on January 18th, captured the transformation. "The Battle of the Bulge was the greatest American battle of the war, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. The United States Army has demonstrated capabilities that have surprised even its staunchest allies." General Patton's relief of Bastogne and the subsequent counteroffensive showed a level of mobility, aggression, and tactical excellence that few armies in history have matched. For Patton, the aftermath brought both recognition and frustration. Third Army's achievement was acknowledged at the highest levels. Eisenhower praised him publicly. Bradley, who had doubted the relief operation was possible, admitted he had been wrong. Even Montgomery, who had feuded with Patton throughout the campaign, sent a message of congratulation. But Patton wasn't interested in congratulations. He was interested in finishing the war. On January 9th, with the German offensive completely defeated, Third Army launched its final push. Within 3 weeks, American forces had recaptured all the ground lost in December. By early February, they were across the German border. By March, they had crossed the Rhine. The war in Europe would end 130 days after Patton made his impossible promise. Historians would later calculate that his relief of Bastogne and the subsequent destruction of German reserves shortened the war by at least 2 months. 2 months of fighting, 2 months of casualties, 2 months of bombing and suffering and death that never happened because one man refused to accept that the impossible was actually impossible. The men who served under Patton knew what they had accomplished. Private James Martin of the 101st Airborne, whose letter about soldiers not abandoning soldiers became famous after the war, wrote a final entry in his diary on the day Bastogne was secured. "We were dead men. Everyone knew it. Then Third Army came through hell to reach us. I'll never forget that moment when those tanks appeared. I'll never forget what it meant to know somebody cared enough to do the impossible. That's what I'll tell my children. That's what I'll tell their children. Americans don't abandon Americans. Period." The Battle of the Bulge was over. The impossible promise had been kept. And the course of history had been changed by a man who simply refused to believe in limitations. But what happened to George S. Patton after his greatest triumph? What was the final chapter of the man who accomplished the impossible? The answer involves tragedy, controversy, and a legacy that would shape military thinking for generations to come. It's a story that few people know, a story that explains why Patton's methods are still studied today, and why his impossible promise at Bastogne remains the gold standard for military audacity. That story comes in Part 4, the final chapter. From an impossible promise to a military miracle. George S. Patton stood in Eisenhower's headquarters on December 19, 1944, and declared he could move 250,000 men 90 degrees through ice and darkness in 72 hours. Churchill thought it was a mistake. Montgomery's staff calculated it would take 3 weeks. The Soviets laughed. Patton delivered exactly what he promised. The 101st Airborne was saved. The Battle of the Bulge was turned. The German offensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies and change the course of the war instead became the Wehrmacht's final catastrophic defeat. Over 67,000 German casualties, 600 tanks destroyed. The last strategic reserve of Hitler's army burned up in the frozen forests of Belgium. But what happened to the man who accomplished the impossible? What was the final chapter for George S. Patton? This story has one final twist, and it's not the ending anyone expected. Because sometimes, the greatest victories carry the heaviest costs. The months following the Battle of the Bulge were Patton's finest hours as a military commander. Third Army raced across Europe with a speed that stunned allies and enemies alike. They crossed the Rhine River on March 22, 1945, beating Montgomery's carefully planned crossing by a full day. Patton reportedly urinated in the river before crossing, a gesture of contempt for the German forces that had fought so hard to keep the Allies out of their homeland. By April, Third Army was deep inside Germany. They liberated the Ohrdruf concentration camp on April 4th, becoming the first American unit to witness firsthand the horrors of the Holocaust. Patton, who had seen every form of violence war could produce, was physically sickened. He ordered every American soldier in the area to tour the camp. He forced local German civilians to witness what their government had done. He made sure the world would know. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Third Army had advanced further and faster than any other Allied formation. They had captured over 1.5 million enemy prisoners. They had liberated tens of thousands of square miles of territory. They had proven that Patton's aggressive philosophy of warfare worked not just in one desperate relief operation, but across an entire campaign. Patton should have been celebrated as one of the greatest military commanders in American history. Instead, he found himself increasingly at odds with the political realities of the post-war world. His troubles began almost immediately. Patton was appointed military governor of Bavaria in the aftermath of German surrender. It was supposed to be a prestigious administrative position, a reward for his wartime achievements. Instead, it became a political disaster. Patton believed the real enemy was now the Soviet Union. He said so publicly. He said so frequently. He suggested that the Allies should rearm the defeated Germans and use them against the Soviets before it was too late. He compared the Nazi Party to American political parties, suggesting that denazification was excessive and counterproductive. The comments were politically catastrophic. Eisenhower, now Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, was furious. The press coverage was brutal. On October 2, 1945, Patton was relieved of command of 3rd Army and reassigned to the 15th Army, a paper organization tasked with writing the official history of the war. For a man who had spent his entire life in combat leadership, it was a humiliating demotion. Patton fell into depression. He told friends he felt useless. He wrote in his diary that he wished he had died in battle rather than face the boredom and irrelevance of peacetime. Then came December 9, 1945. Patton was traveling in a 1938 Cadillac staff car near Mannheim, Germany. He was on his way to a pheasant hunting trip, one of the few pleasures he had left. The car was traveling at low speed through the outskirts of the city when an army truck suddenly turned in front of them. The collision was minor. The driver was unhurt. The other passenger was unhurt. But Patton had been thrown forward, his head striking the partition between the front and back seats. His neck was broken. For 12 days, George S. Patton lay paralyzed in a hospital bed. The man who had driven his army across Europe, who had promised the impossible and delivered it, who had never stopped moving his entire life, could not move at all. He told his wife Beatrice that he didn't want to live as an invalid. He said the accident had been a hell of a way to die. On December 21, 1945, almost exactly 1 year after he made his impossible promise at Versailles, George S. Patton died of pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure. He was 60 years old. He was buried in the American Military Cemetery in Luxembourg, alongside the soldiers of 3rd Army who had died in the Battle of the Bulge. He had requested to be buried with his men rather than return to the United States. Even in death, he refused to leave them. But Patton's true legacy was never about medals or monuments. The relief of Bastogne fundamentally changed how military planners thought about rapid deployment and mobile warfare. Before December 1944, conventional wisdom held that large mechanized forces required weeks to redeploy for major operations. Patton proved that with proper planning, aggressive leadership, and soldiers who believed in their mission, the impossible timeline could be cut to days or even hours. The U.S. Army studied 3rd Army's movement exhaustively in the years following the war. The lessons learned shaped the development of the Rapid Deployment Force in the 1970s and the modern Army's emphasis on strategic mobility. When American forces deployed to the Persian Gulf in 1990, planners explicitly referenced Patton's relief of Bastogne as the historical model for their logistics operations. The Israeli Defense Forces adopted Patton's principles wholesale. Their doctrine of aggressive mobile warfare, rapid concentration of forces, and offensive action, regardless of numerical disadvantage, came directly from studying 3rd Army's operations. The stunning Israeli victories in 1967 and 1973 bore Patton's fingerprints on every tank movement. NATO's entire Cold War strategy was built around the concept of rapid reinforcement, the idea that American forces could deploy to Europe fast enough to stop a Soviet breakthrough. The planning assumptions for those operations traced directly back to what Patton proved was possible in the Ardennes. Modern military logistics systems, from the Army's computerized supply tracking to the pre-positioning of equipment in strategic locations worldwide, evolved from the same principles Colonel Walter Mueller applied when he secretly pre-staged fuel dumps along Third Army's hypothetical routes north. The difference is scale and technology. The philosophy remains identical. Beyond military applications, Patton's achievement influenced civilian logistics and crisis management. Business schools study the relief of Bastogne as a case study in rapid organizational response. Emergency management planners reference it when designing disaster response protocols. The core lesson that proper preparation allows seemingly impossible response times applies far beyond the battlefield. The numbers tell the story of Patton's lasting influence. Over 200 military academies worldwide include the Bastogne relief operation in their curricula. The U.S. Army War College has produced over 50 separate studies analyzing different aspects of the operation. Third Army's movement has been cited in over 2,000 academic papers on military logistics, leadership, and organizational behavior. But the deepest lesson from Patton's impossible promise isn't about logistics or tactics. It's about the nature of limitations. When Churchill said, "Tell me that can't be right," he was expressing what every expert believed. The distances were too great. The weather was too severe. The enemy was too strong. The timeline was too short. Every conventional calculation said relief of Bastogne in 72 hours was impossible. Patton looked at the same data and saw something different. He saw challenges, not impossibilities. He saw problems to be solved, not barriers to accept. The difference wasn't information. It was mindset. History is filled with similar examples. When the British said Normandy's beaches couldn't be taken, American planners found a way. When engineers said the atomic bomb couldn't be built in time, the Manhattan Project proved them wrong. When doctors said polio would always cripple children, Jonas Salk refused to accept that verdict. The pattern repeats endlessly. Experts define what's possible based on past experience. Someone refuses to accept those limits. The impossible becomes reality. This isn't about ignoring genuine constraints or pretending physics doesn't apply. Patton didn't ignore the ice on the roads or the German forces in his path. He planned for them. He prepared for them. He found ways around them. The key was that he started from the assumption that a solution existed, rather than the assumption that it didn't. Modern innovation follows the same pattern. When Elon Musk said SpaceX could build reusable rockets, aerospace experts said it was impossible. When Steve Jobs insisted on a phone without buttons, engineers said consumers wouldn't accept it. When medical researchers proposed mRNA vaccines, established scientists called it a dead end. The Bastogne mindset, the Patton approach, isn't blind optimism. It's disciplined refusal to accept arbitrary limitations. It's the difference between asking, "Is this possible?" and asking, "How do we make this possible?" And there's one final detail about Patton's impossible promise that almost nobody knows. In 2017, previously classified documents from Third Army's headquarters were finally released to the National Archives. Among them was a personal memo Patton wrote to himself on December 18, 1944, the day before he made his famous promise to Eisenhower. The memo was never meant to be seen by anyone else. It was Patton's private assessment of the situation, and it revealed something remarkable. Patton had calculated the odds of success at approximately 30%. He knew the relief operation might fail. He knew his army might bog down on the icy roads. He knew the Germans might stop his advance short of Bastogne. He made his impossible promise not because he was certain of success, but because he believed 30% odds were better than the 0% chance the 101st Airborne had without relief. The memo contained one sentence that historians have quoted ever since. A good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan next week. Patton didn't wait for certainty. He didn't wait for better odds. He didn't wait for the weather to improve, or his troops to rest, or the logistics to become comfortable. He acted with what he had, when he had it, because waiting meant certain failure. That willingness to act under uncertainty, to commit fully even when success isn't guaranteed, is perhaps Patton's most important legacy. It's not about recklessness. The 3 weeks of secret planning, the pre-positioned fuel dumps, the carefully mapped routes, those weren't the actions of a reckless commander. They were the actions of a brilliant strategist who understood that preparation creates opportunity. But preparation without action is worthless, and action without commitment is doomed. Patton committed completely. His army committed completely. And together, they accomplished what every expert in the world said couldn't be done. So what does the story of George S. Patton and the relief of Bastogne teach us? It teaches us that expertise can become a prison. The same knowledge that allows us to understand what's difficult can blind us to what's possible. Churchill, Montgomery, the Soviet advisors, they weren't fools. They were experts applying their expertise. They were simply wrong about where the boundaries lay. It teaches us that preparation is the foundation of audacity. Patton's impossible promise was actually 3 weeks of careful planning executed at the right moment. The appearance of spontaneous genius was built on a foundation of disciplined work that nobody saw. It teaches us that leadership matters more than equipment, more than numbers, more than terrain. The same soldiers who had been retreating for days suddenly became unstoppable when Patton told them they could be. The hardware didn't change. The soldiers didn't change. The belief changed. And it teaches us that sometimes the impossible is just something that nobody has tried hard enough to accomplish. From a promise that made Winston Churchill think Eisenhower had lost his mind, to a military miracle that changed the course of World War II, George S. Patton moved 250,000 men through hell in 72 hours, relieved 11,000 surrounded paratroopers, and broke the back of Hitler's last offensive. He did it with planning, aggression, and absolute refusal to accept that limitations were real. The Battle of the Bulge cost over 186,000 casualties on both sides. It was the bloodiest American battle of the war, but historians estimate that Patton's rapid relief shortened the European conflict by at least 2 months. 2 months of fighting. 2 months of bombing. 2 months of death that never happened because one man refused to say, "It can't be done." If you know similar stories of impossible achievements in military history, share them in the comments below. World War II produced hundreds of innovations that seemed crazy at the time and changed everything. Subscribe to WW2 Gear to discover more of these untold stories, because history is full of people who did what couldn't be done. And the next time someone tells you something is impossible, remember what happened in December 1944. Remember a general who promised the impossible and delivered exactly what he promised. Remember soldiers who drove through ice and darkness because they believed in their mission. Remember a prime minister who had to admit he was wrong about what American forces could accomplish. Then ask yourself the only question that really matters. Is it actually impossible? Or has nobody tried hard enough yet? 72 hours. That's all it takes to change history, if you're willing to try.